Catherine de' Medici has been called many things over the centuries. The Serpent Queen, the Black Queen, the Maggot from Italy's tomb, and even the Devil's Queen. But one thing she was not was boring. History has branded her a poisoner and murderer, but the new historical drama series named The Serpent Queen, starring Oscar nominee Samantha Morton as the Wicked Queen of France, and showing on Stars, gives us a broader view of this much maligned, powerful, and admirable 16th century queen. There is a lot to cover about Catherine de' Medici, from her painful childhood of abandonment and ridicule through her reign as Queen Consort of France and her subsequent years as the Queen Regent during her son's reign. She would draw almost unprecedented fear and hatred from both her enemies and her own subjects, but as is the case with many strong female leaders, much of the criticism laid at Catherine de' Medici's door comes down to sexist notions about a woman's place in the world. Her life spans a history of 16th century Europe with its wars between kingdoms, social unrest, and violence caused by the Protestant Reformation, more wars over religion, including one of the deadliest religious wars in European history, her own efforts to keep the papacy on her side, dynastic marriages, political factions, and, towards the end, her own sons plotting against each other for the throne and power. So let's find out more about this Italian noblewoman who would become Queen of France by exploring a few remarkable facts about Catherine de' Medici and her history. First off, Catherine was not born into royalty. It is a fact that Catherine was not a person of royal blood. Rather, she was born into the now infamous Medici political dynasty of Florence, Italy. The Medicis were not royalty, but an aristocratic family that went into banking and managed to grow their little enterprise into the most powerful bank in Europe in the 15th century, with the Vatican a major client. Catherine's ties to the Vatican were not only political but familial as well. The Roman Catholic Pope at the time of Catherine's birth, Leo X, was a Medici and Catherine's great-uncle. But she was soon to be orphaned at an early age. Within a month of her birth, illness killed both of Catherine's parents. For the rest of her childhood, the vulnerable Medici heiress would be shuffled between relatives and convents to protect her from the family's enemies in an increasingly volatile Italy. Catherine de' Medici never knew a stable childhood. After her parents died, her grandmother Alfonsina Orsini took custody of her, but more tragedy was on the horizon. Alfonsina died just a year later, and Catherine was sent off again. She jumped around from family member to family member for the first years of her life, but by 1523, everything was about to change. Catherine's fortunes shifted when her uncle Giulio de' Medici became Pope Clement VII. Clement brought his young niece to live in an extravagant palace in Florence, where the people took to fondly calling her the Little Duchess. It seemed as though Catherine had finally found peace, but it was all about to be ripped away. Medici power in Florence came crashing down in 1527. Cardinal Silvio Passerini overthrew Pope Clement, and suddenly Catherine's peaceful childhood was thrown into chaos once again. Passerini's forces took Catherine hostage and sent her off to live alone in a series of convents. She was taken from her beloved uncle and his extravagant palaces, but Catherine found a surprising silver lining in her captivity. Life in the convent was simpler and safer than what she was used to, and one chronicler calls this period the happiest time of her entire life. Once she left the convent walls, there was only danger and intrigue awaiting her. In 1527, the Medici dynasty was overthrown in Florence and 8-year-old Catherine was taken hostage. She was held prisoner for 3 years until her uncle Pope Clement managed to rescue her, whereby he immediately set out to find her a husband. And because she was rich, her uncle managed to arrange a marriage with Henry, the second son of the French king in 1533. 14-year-old Catherine married the French prince Henry, only to find out that he had no interest in her while he pursued numerous affairs, leaving Catherine with little chance to bear children, as was, of course, her only duty. Catherine spent this period of her life where she took up learning the ways of the occult and developing an interest in the science of poisons, something that would come back again and again to haunt her for the rest of her life. There is an interesting story here about how Catherine was supposed to have poisoned the Queen of Navarre, a neighboring kingdom. to ensure the marriage of her daughter to the Queen of Navarre's son. It was said that Catherine used an ingenious way to deliver the poison, but I won't go into that right now. I'll save that little tidbit for another video. In 1536, Henry's older brother caught a chill, contracted a fever, and died, so Henry became heir apparent to the throne. The pressure was now on for Catherine to produce some heirs post-haste, which, spoiler alert, finally happened such that Catherine eventually bore 10 children. 3 of them were sons who lived to become kings themselves. When Catherine's husband, King Henry II, died in 1559, Catherine was no longer queen but was, instead, queen regent. But that didn't lessen her power. In fact, with her husband dead, Catherine's reign as the Black Queen really took off. It was at this point that Catherine had to become extremely cunning to ensure the rule of her sons. She wasn't about to give up all those years learning the court strategies needed to grasp, consolidate, and increase power to her benefit and the benefit of her sons and family. She was, after all, a Medici. And the story doesn't end there. Catherine's story continues on with loads of palace intrigue, medieval power grabs, graphic deaths, and more. The series is based upon an historical biography that goes into great detail about Catherine's many plots, murders, and even the sacrifice of her own child. She ordered assassinations of individuals who put her son's kingdom in jeopardy. She clearly ordered the murder of Lignerolles, a gentleman who Catherine believed was steering her son Henry towards religious fanaticism and perversion. She also beat her daughter Margot for daring to engage in romantic liaisons with Henry of Guise. The Guise brothers were thorns in Catherine's side that enraged her to no end. Like I said, there is a lot that goes on in the story of the Serpent Queen, and we haven't even made it to the day known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, for which Catherine was truly reviled. No wonder Starz made it into a series, and I doubt the first season will manage to cover it all, and it is promoted that the Starz show is coming from, wait for it, a feminine perspective. The show writers want you to know that this is truly the real Catherine de' Medici, and she's telling her own story. Either way, there is no sugarcoating the fact that Catherine de' Medici was one tough lady. Coming up next, the early life of Catherine de' Medici. This video will give you the historically true and chronological history of Catherine de' Medici's life story. Let's begin. Catherine de' Medici was born on April 13, 1519, in Florence, Italy, to Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, and Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, a relative of King Francis I of France. Lorenzo de' Medici was merely a commoner, but Madeleine was of noble birth, being the daughter of a count and duchess. Their marriage in 1518 was a political agreement between the king and Pope Leo X, who was head of the Catholic Church at the time. Pope Leo just happened to be of the Medici family, and as the head of the Catholic Church and ruler of the Papal States, he promised to support Francis's claim to the throne in exchange for Francis's promise to ensure that the Vatican would have full authority over the Catholic Church in France. Catherine was the only child of Lorenzo and Madeleine, who are said to have been elated at her birth and looking forward to raising their child. But both of Catherine's parents died within a month of her birth, her father from syphilis and her mother from either the same affliction or perhaps from the plague. Baby Catherine was taken in by her paternal grandmother, Alfonsina Orsini, who herself managed to die shortly afterwards, so little Catherine was shuttled off to an aunt to be cared for, but that didn't last. Little Catherine jumped around from family member to family member for the first years of her life, but by 1523, everything was about to change. When another of her Medici relatives was elected pope, this time Giulio de' Medici, who became known as Pope Clement VII in 1523. He decided Catherine would be a good political asset and had the young preteen installed in the family palace. The Medici family was wealthy and prosperous, by this time having made their fortune in banking. The wealth of the Medici family allowed them access to political power in Florence, even though they were not regarded as equals by the aristocracy, which made them all that more determined to gain power in any way that they could. But alas, in 1527, the Medici family's power came crashing down. They were ousted from Florence, and 8-year-old Catherine spent 3 years living in convents, with her life threatened at times due to her family name, until the Pope called her to Rome in 1530 to arrange her marriage. Clement VII saw this as an opportunity for a Medici to rise to aristocracy, when King Francis I of France offered his son Henry, in 1533, in marriage to Catherine. So, of course, he accepted. 14-year-old Catherine married 14-year-old Henry in October of that same year. Although Henry played the part of the groom, as was expected of him, at the wedding and during the wedding night, in truth, Henry had absolutely no interest in Catherine and spent most nights with his mistresses and eventually, or right from the start according to some sources, with his main love interest, Diane de Poitiers. Diane was everything Catherine was not. She was supremely self-confident and beautiful, an aristocrat whose parents had encouraged her athletic interests and education in a wide array of subjects, including architecture and the law. She was also independently wealthy since, after the death of her husband, she had made use of her legal skills to retain his estate without the requirement of a male consort supervisor. Catherine was queen in name only. She had no political power and no influence over the king or the court. She was distrusted by the courtiers as a foreigner and shunned as a commoner. Further complicating her position, she seemed unable to conceive a child. In 1536, Henry's older brother Francis died of fever and Henry became heir to the throne. It was now more important than ever that Catherine give Henry a child, and so she took to folk remedies to increase fertility, such as placing cow dung on her source of life, if you know what I mean, and drinking animal urine. She consulted astrologers and folk healers, and later the physician and seer Nostradamus, who she elevated to the position of chief physician for her son Charles IX. Her association with astrology, which the church condemned, as well as with folk remedies, Nostradamus and others like him, is the source of the later claim that she was involved in occult practices. At the same time, however, she was also suspected of being a witch because of her inability to conceive. The proper function of a woman was understood to be childbearing, and those who could not conceive were apt to raise suspicions of witchery because witches were understood to be in league with the devil, who could not generate life, and so were infertile. Catherine was never charged with witchcraft, but there were suggestions by the nobility that the king should divorce her. Henry, meanwhile, was spending his nights with Diane. Diane had been a lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude of France, Henry's mother, who died when he was young, and she seems to have been seen as a mother figure by him at an early age. As his lover, she was the most powerful woman in France, but she encouraged his relationship with Catherine, and especially that he spend more time in Catherine's bedchamber than her own, to co-create an heir to the throne. Catherine gave birth to her first son, Francis II, in 1544, and afterwards found no difficulty in conceiving further, eventually giving birth to 10 children, 7 of whom lived to adulthood or young adulthood. Catherine had 15 good years of marriage with Henry, and she had truly fallen in love with her husband, in spite of the fact that he never gave up Diane as his mistress. But as with so many of the good moments in Catherine's life, it came to an abrupt end. In 1559, Henry II arranged a marriage between his daughter Elizabeth of Valois to King Philip II of Spain. The marriage celebration included jousting tournaments, a sport Henry was especially skilled in and proud of. When he was unseated by his opponent, the Comte de Montgomery, he called for a rematch, during which Montgomery's lance shattered against Henry's helmet, sending shards of wood into his eye and forehead. The wood penetrated into his brain, and he lived a little over 2 weeks before succumbing to the injury. Throughout this time, Catherine remained by his side, and although he called for Diane de Poitiers, Catherine denied her entrance to the chamber. Some call Catherine cruel because of this, but I totally side with Catherine. After Henry's death, Catherine chose to dress in black, for the custom was that widows could wear either white or black, and she took the broken lance as her own personal symbol for the next phase of her life. At this point, Catherine's life changed dramatically, and some say this is when she really began to flourish. Up until this point, Catherine had been the dutiful and submissive queen, but the minute she stepped into power, she began to wield it fiercely, as shown with her actions towards Diane de Poitiers. Many people don't realize that Catherine was a skillful chess player, first on the board as a child, and now she would use those skills in her life as a queen of France. Catherine de Medici was a woman of her times, and a woman ahead of her time. She received an education far beyond what was considered respectable for a woman. She cultivated the arts, poetry, and architecture and was truly as accomplished as her husband's mistress. And yet, she came to be called the Serpent Queen, along with the Dark Queen, the Black Queen, and even the Queen of Poisons. In Part 2 of the life history of Catherine de Medici, I'll cover the many events that occurred in Catherine's life after her husband's death that earned her these disparaging titles and explore just what is true and what was said to be true, even when it was not, about Catherine de Medici, Queen of France, for 30 years. Now on to Part 2 of the life of this fabulous, fierce, and feisty woman in history. As you will see if you watch the Star's historical drama, The Serpent Queen, Catherine de Medici becomes Queen of France when Henry II ascends the French throne in 1533. She is forced to become the seemingly docile wife who has to put up with a philandering husband who has a favorite mistress. This sounds so much like the story of Princess Diana and Charles when, as Diana said, there are 3 people in this marriage. And like Diana's story, this affair went on all the time that Catherine was Queen of France by her husband's side until his death by a chunk of wood thrust into his brain in 1559. Luckily, and I say that for Catherine, he died and left Catherine with 3 sons who would bring her to power in her own right. Upon the death of Henry II, his 15-year-old son was crowned King Francis II. Francis could legally rule on his own, but he knew he wasn't up to it and bowed to his mother's authority as the now Queen Regent. They commenced to issue decrees jointly, with Catherine's name coming noticeably to the forefront. Catherine established herself as the power behind Francis II, but not without competition for this newly gained power. Not surprisingly, the idea of a woman having too much power and ruling a country was, dare I say, feared, and most certainly despised by everyone of that time period. As events go, the new King Francis was to inherit, along with the throne, his father's 2 trusted advisors who were both French Protestants who followed the reformist John Calvin. At that time, these Protestants were commonly called Huguenots. But the Catholics wanted their religion to be the one that France adopted. So along came 2 Catholic brothers known as the Dukes of Guise, or let's just call them the Guise brothers. They opposed the Huguenots taking hold in the country, and they were of a noble family, so they had some leverage to work their own way into the monarchy. The Guise brothers, with their personal agenda, stepped in and quickly isolated Francis II from his father's Protestant advisors. Catherine just as quickly recognized the threat the Guise posed and diplomatically invited them to instruct and counsel her son, moving herself into the background as Queen Regent, but still maintaining her influence over her inexperienced son, the king. Now, here is where it gets really messy. Lots of intrigue mixed up with the religious wars of 16th century France, along with murder and mayhem. In 1560, a group of Protestants planned to kidnap Francis II to rescue him from the Guises' influence, but the plot, known as the Amboise Conspiracy, was discovered and the participants jailed or executed. Tensions throughout the country continued until 1562, when Francis, Duke of Guise, slaughtered members of a Protestant congregation in the Massacre of Vassy and set off the French Wars of Religion. In the same year, Catherine lost her son Francis II to an ear infection, and her second son, Charles IX, became King of France at the tender age of 9. This presented a problem when a competing royal household known as the Bourbon, or as we say, the Bourbons, just like the whiskey, were eager to step in and present their son, Antoine de Bourbon, as regent, since Charles was not of mature age to rule. But the Bourbons had a relative by the name of Louis de Bourbon, who had been arrested after the Amboise Conspiracy and slated for execution. This was leverage for Catherine to trade the life of Louis de Bourbon for Antoine's renunciation of his claim as regent, and so she was able to maintain her position as Queen Regent. Another of Catherine's problems resolved itself when Francis, Duke of Guise, was assassinated in 1563, thereby loosening the hold the Guise had on the throne. This allowed Catherine to assert more control over Charles IX and ensure her hold on the power of the throne. One thing that is often overlooked in the history of Catherine de' Medici is that she worked hard to bring peace to France while the wars of religion were raging around her and her son's kingdom. One instance where she demonstrated her interest in reconciling Protestants and Catholics was when she met with the Queen of Navarre, who you remember was a Protestant, to reach some sort of compromise and end the battles if possible. When these efforts failed, she had her son, King Charles IX, contact representatives of the Ottoman Empire with a plan to relocate, or one could say, displace, Protestant French to Ottoman Moldavia, which is now part of Romania, but there was no incentive given and the Ottomans rejected the proposal. In 1567, Charles IX was ambushed by Protestant forces in what is known as the Surprise of Meaux, which he and Catherine barely escaped. And so it was at this point that she then abandoned hopes of reconciliation in the War of Religions and, according to some historians, began formulating a plan to execute the Protestants leading the revolt against the Catholics. This claim has been challenged, although there is evidence that Catholic nobles had suggested such a plan as early as 1560 or earlier, and it seems likely that Catherine would have been aware of it, even if she did not conceive of it herself. Since one of the most powerful Protestant leaders, Louis de Bourbon, had been executed after surrendering in 1569, and the Protestant Queen Jeanne d'Albret of Navarre was untouchable in her stronghold of La Rochelle, it was devised that the most accessible target for assassination was the Protestant and former advisor to King Henry II, Gaspard de Coligny, Admiral of France. Now that the target was identified, all that was left was to arrange the time and place. The story goes like this. Catherine proposed to the Protestant Queen Jeanne d'Albret the marriage of her daughter Margaret to the Queen's son Henry as part of the intricate plot to lure the leading Protestants to Paris for execution, although in truth there is no historical evidence to support this story. The wedding was set for August 18th of that same year and drew Protestants from all over the country to Catholic Paris. The Protestant leaders, including Admiral Coligny, were all housed in a specific area of Paris, and 3 days after the wedding, an assassination attempt was made on Coligny as he returned to his apartment. He was wounded in his hand and arm by gunshot and was carried to his chambers. The would-be assassin was never identified. And this is where things really got out of hand. The Protestants suspected the French crown of complicity in the assassination attempt, and Charles IX and Catherine, fearing they would be attacked, ordered a preemptive strike, which would become a terrible day in France known as the Saint Bartholomew's Day Massacre. On the night of August 23rd, it was decided that all of the Protestant leaders should be eliminated, and the massacre began the next morning with the accomplished murder of Coligny, who was killed in his apartment, thrown out the window, and decapitated. The other leaders were quickly slaughtered, and although Charles IX then called for restraint and an end to the violence, the common people took to the streets, hunting down Protestants and Protestant sympathizers and killing them. News of the massacre spread, and more Protestants were murdered in other cities and towns throughout France, resulting in a death toll in the thousands, with a low count at around 5,000, but more likely over 25,000 or more killed on that day. Needless to say, the marriage of Henry of Navarre and Margaret failed spectacularly in achieving the hoped-for peace and reconciliation intended. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre encouraged the same level of violence that would spread throughout the rest of the country, resulting in a France divided between the largely Catholic population of the north and the Protestants in the south. The religious wars of France raged on with Catherine still squarely at the helm of the monarchy, beside her son, Charles IX. Catherine's daughter Margaret, also known as Margot of Valois or Marguerite de Valois, would also become a major player in the wars of religion as well as the royal history of France. She too was a much maligned queen whose true story needs to be told, so you can bet that I have a video on her life story as well. Now back to Catherine de' Medici and how she continues to hold her power for a time, even through the death of yet another son king. France was now divided between a Catholic North and Protestant South. Henry of Navarre had managed to escape execution in the massacre by falsely promising to convert to Catholicism and then took command of Protestant forces with Henry I of Bourbon against the Catholic League, which was headed by Henry I, Duke of Guise. Catherine turned to working once again with the House of Guise as she and her son, King Charles IX, strove to find a way to restore peace. In the aftermath of the massacre, King Charles's fragile mental and physical constitution weakened drastically. His mood swung from boasting about the extremity of the massacre to exclamations that the screams of the murdered Huguenots kept ringing in his ears. Frantically, he blamed alternately himself or his mother. His words of condemnation against his mother would later become the fuel for hatred against Catherine. Charles' physical condition, most likely TB, deteriorated to the point where, by the spring of 1574, his coughing turned bloody and his hemorrhages grew more violent. So it was that Charles IX died May 30th, 1574 at the age of 23. But Catherine had one more son left who was already a king. Catherine's son Henry III had left the country to reign in Poland, and upon the death of Charles, Catherine wrote to him to return to France to claim the French throne. More royal intrigue and machinations and more murder pursued with the new king Henry III in power. Alliances would shift, and eventually, it was all too much for the aging Serpent queen who was approaching 70. Henry III was doing less to bring peace to the country and more to cement his power as King of France. Henry broke from Catherine's hold as Queen Regent and murdered members of the Guise family who were plotting against him. Catherine was devastated by her son's actions, so much so that it contributed to her failing health. She died on January 5, 1589, most likely from pleurisy. By that time, Paris was held by enemies of the crown, and the vitriol against Catherine began. It was written that when she died, she was treated with as much consideration as, get this, a dead goat. 8 months later, Henry III was stabbed to death and was preceded to the throne by his sister's husband, Henry of Navarre, to become Henry IV of France, who had this to say about Catherine. I ask you, what could a woman do? Left by the death of her husband with 5 little children on her arms, and 2 families of France, the Guise and the Bourbons, who were thinking of grasping the crown. Was she not compelled to play strange parts, to deceive first one and then the other, in order to guard, as she did, her sons, who successively reigned through the wise conduct of that shrewd woman? I am surprised that she never did worse. Coming up next, why it took so long for the young Catherine de' Medici to bear children, and you might just be shocked at the reason. Let's begin this story when a young Catherine de' Medici had been wed to Henry, the future King of France, in the 16th century, for over 5 years. Despite the fact that the husband and wife were both young and healthy, Catherine was unable to fulfill her most important responsibility, producing an heir to the throne. This caused great anguish for Catherine and put her in mortal danger. But why couldn't she conceive? Be sure to stay to the end to find out what it was all about. Gossip around court revolved around Catherine's not-so-pleasant appearance, meaning that Henry found her unappealing, and the fact that Catherine had a rival for Henry's affections. Her name was Diane de Poitiers, and Henry was madly in love with her. He had been since he was a young child, and Diane, who was serving as a lady-in-waiting to his grandmother, kissed him tenderly on the cheek as he was being sent off to Spain as a diplomatic hostage. When Henry's father, King Francis I of France, found himself a prisoner in Spain during a battle there, he was captured and imprisoned by his enemies. Desperate to be free and return to France, Francis made a truly heartless deal with his captors and negotiated his own release in return for his 2 sons to be held in his stead, Henry and Henry's older brother. Henry was only 7 years old when Diane gave him that motherly kiss, which Henry never forgot, so much so that Diane became in Henry's mind both a replacement for the mother he lost at age 5 and a lover who he yearned for throughout his years of captivity in Spain. When Henry was released from captivity a few years later as a young teenager, he returned to court and was married to Catherine soon after. And not long after that, he and Diane de Poitiers became lovers, even as she was a good 20 years older than the teen. After a time, rumors began to spread throughout the French court that Catherine was incapable of conceiving. Some said that their love affair kept Catherine from Henry's bed, but that is not really why the royal couple could not conceive. There was talk of divorce, both because of Catherine's apparent infertility and because her opulent dowry had never been completely paid for. It seems that when Catherine's marriage had been arranged by her Medici uncle, Pope Clement VII, as a means to secure the authority of the Catholic Church in France, the Pope had promised an exorbitant amount of money and gold to be paid in installments. But the Pope died in Rome a year after the wedding, and the payments to Catherine's dowry came to a halt. Then there was the presumed bastard child of Henry's. Back in 1537, during the Italian Wars in which Henry took part at the urging of his father, Henry took up lodging with an Italian squire named Gian Antonio Ducci. While there, Henry was seduced by Gian Antonio's sister Philippa, and she became his mistress. Word got out that Philippa was pregnant and that Henry was the father, all of which played well in Henry's favor. Philippa gave birth to a girl who was named after Henry's mistress, Diane, and Philippa benefited with a handsome sum paid by King Francis I. The young child became known as Diane de France and was brought to the French court to be raised by none other than Diane de Poitiers. In the eyes of the court and the court gossips, this earlier escapade of Henry's proved that Henry was not sterile, and therefore it must be that Catherine was the one at fault. So it was that Catherine found herself in a dangerous political position. A rival noble family called the Guises were plotting to replace her with a queen of their own on the basis that she was deemed infertile. Catherine had to act fast, so she strategically put aside her pride and launched a calculated preemptive strike. The young Catherine poised hopelessly at Henry's father's feet, King Francis I, proclaiming that she adored Henry more than anything and only desired for him to have a bride who could bear him an heir. All she wanted, Catherine claimed, was that she be allowed to remain in France so that she may kindly serve her beloved's new spouse. Catherine was betting on the king's inability to stand the sight of a young lady in tears. Francis was moved to tears himself and proclaimed that it was God's will that Catherine was the wife of his son and that the issue of replacing her with anyone else was settled. Once she was secure again in her position at court, Catherine knew she had to attack this problem of her infertility from every and any direction that she could think of. She set out to pursue multiple interventions, including surrounding herself with doctors, astrologers, magicians, alchemists, and seers. She made use of tarot cards and charms and resorted to medieval remedies. She drank the urine of pregnant animals, consumed the powdered sexual organs of boars and cats, and mixed many different herbs in her food and wine. Another remedy was to consume the left hind paw of a weasel mixed with vinegar. Someone, God knows who, went so far as to tell her that, during coitus, she must wear over her source of life organ a soft, warm, extremely smelly poultice made of ground stag antlers and cow dung. It seems incredible that Henry would want to get close enough to even attempt conceiving offspring, but they both were required to make a concerted effort to get the job done. Eventually, Catherine had to turn to other measures, which involved Henry's mistress, Diane de Poitiers. The story goes that Catherine had a hole made into the floor above Diane's chambers so that she could peek through in an effort to see if there was something that she was missing about how to make a baby. It is also said that Catherine went so far as to demean herself and stoop to asking Diane for conjugal advice. At her wit's end, Catherine had a doctor by the name of Jean Fernel do a thorough physical examination on both her and Henry. According to the anatomy of their individual reproductive organs, the doctor came up with a solution. Because the specifics of the doctor's examination and his subsequent advice is not recorded in the annals of history, we cannot be entirely sure of what was the problem. But I did find an article on the web that has a suggestion or two as to what may have been going on with the young royals. It seems that it may be possible that Henry had a condition related to his, shall we say, manhood? This might be astonishing and even shocking, but it could be that Henry had a mild penile deformity that had caused their childlessness, called hypospadias with Cordy. It's a physical malformation that makes it difficult for a man to impregnate a woman because, of all things, the opening is not where it is supposed to be. The abnormal opening can form anywhere from just below where it is supposed to be to other locations. There are different degrees of hypospadias. Some can be minor and others more severe. Surprisingly, researchers today estimate that about 1 in every 200 babies is born with this abnormality in the United States, making it one of the most common birth defects. So if Henry was born with this birth defect, then some historical accounts suggesting that the good Dr. Fennell's solution was to find a coital position to assist with the problem seems plausible. Others allude to the fact that Diane also had input to the situation, since she had intimate knowledge of Henry's anatomy and she, too, had some ideas on how to take certain positions to remedy the situation. Whatever the good doctor or Diane had to suggest, Catherine was finally able to conceive, and she delivered her first child, Francis, named after Grandpapa, of course, who would become King Francis II of France. Now that they had the method down, Catherine quickly conceived again, and on April 2, 1545, she bore a daughter, Elizabeth, who would become a Queen of Spain as the third spouse of Philip II of Spain. She went on to bear Henry a further 8 children, 5 of whom survived early childhood, including the future Charles IX of France, born June 27, 1550. The future Henry III, born September 19, 1551. Margaret of Valois, born May 14, 1553. Francis, Duke of Anjou, born March 18, 1555. And a daughter named Claude of France, born November 12, 1547. By the time she was done with childbearing, Catherine de' Medici was ready to take on the position of Queen Regent, which she would hold till her death. Thanks to the 3 future kings of France, she was able to conceive in spite of Henry's shocking condition. In this next chapter, we'll see how the Serpent Queen Catherine de' Medici rallied the women around her to collectively act as her troupe of female spies. It wasn't easy being a woman in power during the 16th century. Catherine de' Medici, the Serpent Queen, learned this at a very young age when she left her native Italy to marry the future King of France, Henry II. Disliked by the people as a suspicious foreigner and ignored by her husband in favor of his French mistress, Diane de Poitiers, Catherine had to use any means available to her to preserve her power as queen. Catherine saw firsthand the possibility of utilizing the boudoir as a battleground after witnessing the influence Diane de Poitiers had on her husband, so she started to assemble a potent squadron of high-class seductresses to do her bidding. Called the Flying Squadron, Catherine's band of temptresses would become as much a part of Catherine's legend as poison and intrigue. This band of beautiful women loyal to their queen engaged in outrageous, spurious activities, all with the aim of helping her retain power. The group of around 80 low-ranking noblewomen were handpicked for their charms and sexual prowess, and the court delighted in sharing tales of their sordid activities. The name Flying Squadron has its roots in dance when Catherine introduced ballet to the French court and her own ladies gave the first performance and danced as though they were flying. The military connotations of the term squadron were particularly apt for Catherine's court, as she employed her ladies as her soldiers to fight her battles. Women during this period had to use the few means available to them to wield power, and the squadron found that many powerful men were defenseless against beautiful women. As a young queen, Catherine had no power, but when her husband, Henry II, died from a jousting accident and his sons, a series of 1, 2, and 3 of them, ascended the throne, she was clever enough and shrewd enough to find her way to a position of unprecedented power as the Queen Regent. To maintain and increase that power, Catherine, who had a reputation for being ruthless and conniving, devised a plan to train members of the Flying Squadron to seduce prominent European political leaders to manipulate the will of men and unearth their secrets. When her first son, Francis, took the throne upon Henry II's death, Catherine had to find a way to attain the position as Queen Regent in competition with King Antoine of Navarre, following tradition that only a male may serve as regent for a young monarch. Clever Catherine commanded one of her ladies of her flying squadron, Louise de la Baraudière, to seduce and manipulate Antoine into handing over the regency to Catherine. She needed Antoine to relinquish his traditional claim to power willingly, for if she had seized power through unjust and wily means, nothing else she did would be seen as legitimate. Even though many of the ladies from the Flying Squadron's identities have been lost to history, some of them can still claim their fame. French nobility Isabelle de Limoille served as the maid of honor at the court of the Queen Regent. She was requested to join the Flying Squadron because of her beauty. She was described as a stunning woman with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a rosy complexion. She took many lovers, often becoming involved with associates of the House of Guise, one of Catherine de' Medici's most ferocious rivals. In about 1562, at Catherine's instigation, Isabelle became the mistress of Louis, Prince of Condé, brother of King Antoine of Navarre and one of the leading Huguenots in France. She was banished from the court 2 years later, when she created a scandal by giving birth to his son while the court was on a royal tour of the country. She later married wealthy Tuscan banker Scipione Sardini, a favored protégé of Catherine de' Medici. Another famous member of the squadron was Charlotte de Sauvé, who helped eliminate another major threat to Catherine's power. When the Queen Regent got word of a plot between Henry of Navarre and her youngest son, Francis, Duke of Anjou, to overthrow her, she sent in Madame de Sauvé to seduce both men. Catherine's daughter bitterly recalled how well her mother's plan worked. Madame de Sauvé treated Henry of Navarre and her brother Francis in such a way that they became extremely jealous of each other, to such a point that they forgot their ambitions, their duties and their plans, and thought of nothing but chasing after this woman. It is said that Charlotte de Sauvé was also the informant that led to a number of executions, including Joseph Boniface de la Moye. He was accused of making an attempt on the king's life when a wax figurine pricked with needles, which he had obtained from the astrologer Cosimo Ruggieri, was found in his possession. After being subjected to questioning and torture, he was condemned to death, drawn and quartered and beheaded for his crime of either trusting a woman or treason against the king. Perhaps the best known and most often retold story about the squadron is the 1577 banquet that Catherine organized to celebrate one of her son's victories. The queen was known for her elaborate feasts, and during this particular one, it is said that her ladies of the Flying Squadron served guests food while, get this, going completely topless. Thus, the plot against the throne was foiled without a single drop of blood being shed, leading one satirist to exclaim, "Catherine, you are fortunate to have a stable of, well, I can't say the word because of YouTube's algorithm, but you get the idea." But lest you think that it was all fun and debauchery, know that Catherine de' Medici's investment in magnificent entertainments was part of a conscious political program. She recalled the belief of her father-in-law, King Francis I, that the court needed to be physically active and constantly entertained. She also declared her intention to imitate the Roman emperors, who kept their subjects from mischief by occupying them with games and amusements. She therefore adopted a policy of distracting her nobles from fighting among themselves by laying on irresistible entertainments and placing her ladies of the Flying Squadron in their beds. She and her ladies were so notorious that the Protestant Huguenot Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, wrote from the court to warn her son Henry that Catherine presided over a vicious and corrupt atmosphere, in which, of all things, the women made the sexual advances and not the men. You might wonder at this point why the women of Catherine's Flying Squadron would be willing to perform the tasks that were required of them. There could be a number of reasons. Perhaps they did it for the wealth and any extra favors they would receive from their queen, or to increase their own political influence and that of family members. Or perhaps they were afraid to refuse their queen out of fear of retribution. Or perhaps they just did what needed to be done out of a sense of public duty to the crown. Something akin to patriotism. But there is another possibility. As I said earlier, women during this period in history had to use the few means available to them to gain any sense of empowerment. What could be more exciting than participating in court intrigue and getting the upper hand on the men who held all the power? I would imagine that some of the women could very well have enjoyed the thrill of the game. Coming up next, Catherine de' Medici's joyful magnificence parties and how they might seem a little weird, but you can bet that every event was a strategic part of the Serpent Queen's ascent to power. She knew she had to keep her enemies and friends alike entertained with lavish parties meant to amaze and stupefy. It was no holds barred when it came to keeping the feuding French nobles distracted enough to prevent them from fighting against each other, to the detriment of the country and, of course, the royal authority. She was, after all, a brilliant political strategist in the 16th century royal court of France. She was none other than Catherine de' Medici, the Serpent Queen. King Henry II of France died in 1559, and that was all that was needed for his wife, Queen Consort Catherine, to come into power and take her place in history as one of not only the most cunning and clever rulers of all Europe, but also as a patron extraordinaire of the arts. After King Henry's death, Catherine de' Medici gained control of the royal purse, and she set about organizing an expansive program of artistic patronage which lasted for 3 decades. She employed Italian artists and performers, imitating what her father-in-law, King Francis I, had started and which came to be known as the politics of magnificence. Biographer Leonie Frieda writes that Catherine, more than anyone, inaugurated the fantastic entertainments for which later French monarchs also became renowned. And through these amusements, Catherine was also able to display her artistic creativity, heralding the European Renaissance. So here are some things you didn't know about Catherine de' Medici's joyful magnificence parties. And there might be 1 or 2 that just might strike you as a bit weird. 1. She brought ice cream to France. Believe it or not, back in the 16th century, they actually had the means to make ice cream called gelato that was created by chilling pastry cream in specially constructed rooms made to keep ice transported from the glaciers in the mountains of northern Italy. When Catherine de' Medici went to France to marry the man who would become King Henry II of France, she brought with her an entourage of dressmakers, perfumers, spicers, cooks, and a bevy of Italian confectioners who specialized in making chilled drinks and frozen sherbet for her elaborate parties. 2. She enchanted everyone with fireworks. When Catherine's 16-year-old son, Francois II, ascended to the throne upon the death of his father Henry II, Catherine arranged the first fireworks display in the history of France to celebrate his coronation. While fireworks had made their way to Europe in the 13th century, by the 15th century, they were widely used for religious festivals and public entertainment, with Catherine de' Medici leading the way by using fireworks to enchant her subjects and illuminate her various castles on important occasions. 3. She made ballet into a big deal. Coming from wealth and from Italy, Catherine never lost the love of her Italian background and the arts that her wealthy family sponsored. She made the large-scale Italian pageants that combined theater with dance and turned them into ballet in the French court. As a strategist, Catherine promoted ballet as the vehicle she chose for political statements. She invented the ballet de cour, or court ballet, in which kings, queens, and courtiers danced to an admiring public with the intent of defining ballet as an art of harmonious royal and aristocratic spectacle. Essentially, she used ballet as a form of deliberate, elaborate, and expensive propaganda. In 1573, she put on an hour-long ballet in which 16 dancers representing the 16 provinces of France performed intricate and complex movements symbolizing a transition from tension to harmony. The ballet was a triumph of expressive geometry that was designed with so many turns, swerves, interlacings, and minglings by the dancers representing confrontations and withdrawals, that it was surprising that it all went off without a single stumble. 4. She memorialized her parties in golden threads. Today, tapestries are minor works of art, but during the Renaissance, nothing was declared more spectacular than a set of tapestries woven in gold thread. Catherine was so proud of her magnificence parties that she memorialized them into a set of 8 extravagant tapestries known as the Valois tapestries. For example, one tapestry depicted an elaborate banquet on an island located in a river that runs through both France and northern Spain. The guests were ferried on decorated boats to the island where they passed, among other spectacles, a Greek figure riding 2 dolphins, harpoonists spearing an artificial whale that spouted red wine, and 6 Greek gods and goddesses sitting on a giant turtle, blowing conch shells. Her son, Charles IX, was transported on a barge dressed to look like a floating fortress. The banquet was followed by a ballet of nymphs and other mythological creatures. It was so magnificent that the Spaniards who hated the French swore that they had never seen anything finer. 5. She held lavish cross-dressing parties. Catherine de' Medici's son, Henry III of France, struggled to produce an heir, and Catherine lamented this fact. So what did she do? She held lavish cross-dressing parties where men dressed as women and women went topless as men, all in an effort to rekindle Henry's interest in his wife. This didn't work out as planned, but the parties themselves became legendary. This might not make a lot of sense until you know that Henry was actually gay and a cross-dresser himself. Historical evidence exists that he had sexual relationships with both women and men, and that he employed a number of favorite male companions in his court called mignon couchettes, translated means bedroom favorites. One contemporary gossip columnist wrote that Henry frequently wore women's clothing and that he lavished money and attention on his male companions who wore their long hair curled with little bonnets of velvet on top, and the ruffles on their linen shirts were of starched finery and so high so that their heads looked like they were sitting on a platter. You can imagine these men at some wild parties where the columnist reports that they, quote, made themselves exceedingly odious, as much by their foolish and haughty demeanor as by their effeminate and immodest dress, but above all, by the immense gifts that the king gave to them. Truthfully, none of the things about Catherine de' Medici's parties are all that weird by today's standards. Other details about this French queen that history doesn't talk much about revolve around just how much she contributed to the European Renaissance, that fervent period of European cultural, artistic, political, and economic rebirth that bridged the gap between the Middle Ages and modern-day civilization. She was a collector of great works of art, including troves of paintings of loved ones, literature, and an avid builder of architectural wonders, along with being a keen collector of curiosities including fans, dolls, caskets, games, pious objects, a stuffed chameleon, and 7 stuffed crocodiles, which in itself could be called slightly weird. However you look at it, the Serpent Queen Catherine de' Medici knew how to host a party, and how her parties of magnificence were a means to an end, the end being staying in power as Queen Regent of France. Now, let's learn a little bit more about some of the other characters in the show and how Catherine handled them. First, there is King Henry II's mistress, Diane de Poitiers. And I'll start with some of the weirdest things about Diane de Poitiers that you may not have known. Diane de Poitiers was Queen Catherine de' Medici's rival at the 16th century French court. As the story goes, Queen Catherine and Diane, as King Henry II's favorite mistress, reputedly loathed each other and spent the majority of their lives competing for the attention of Henry before and after he was crowned king. Here are some of the strangest things about Diane de Poitiers that kept her the king's favorite right up to his death. She was a tomboy. Diane was obsessed with physical fitness and excessively proud of her body. Some say she loved to boast about her breast. As a child, she was a keen athlete, keeping active by riding and swimming every day. And after having 2 children with her doddering old husband, more on that later, she became obsessive about keeping a trim, fit figure. She went riding and swimming regularly, making her body toned and athletic in a time where people expected women to just sit still and look pretty. She was also an obsessive bather. Diane bathed as often as 3 times a day in cold water and also at night if there was moonlight. This was at a time when people rarely bathed and used copious amounts of perfume to cover their body odor. Frigid, cold water was her bathing temperature of choice. It was perfect to keep her skin tight and keep a young appearance, since she was much older than her royal paramour. She used sperm whale vomit on her face. According to an inside source at the court, Diane made a facial mask using melon juice, crushed young barley, and an egg yolk, mixed with ambergris, a type of sperm whale vomit. It has a somewhat marine yet fecal odor when first harvested, but acquires a sweet, earthy scent as it ages, so we can only hope that she used it after it had aged for a while. She wore a mask, but not for the reason that you think. Let's face it, pun intended, Diane was extremely vain. She protected her face from the sun and wind at all times by wearing a black velvet mask called a vizard, which covered her whole face. She had an extremely white complexion, as was the rage at that time. But not because she used makeup to achieve the look. Rather, she was anemic from, well, the next fact tells you why. She drank and bathed gold. Diane primarily drank gold straight up, believing it to be an elixir of youth. Did I say she was vain? Diane actually drank so much of this golden elixir that when specimens of her hair were analyzed after excavation of her body in 2008, it was found to have gold concentrations 500 times more than what would be considered healthy, plus her hair shafts were extremely thin, indicating a possible symptom of gold toxicity. She was also known to have bathed with some form of gold in her bathwater. She had a thing for Diana the Huntress. There have been at least 18 works of art, paintings, sketches, or medallions identified with Diane as the model. She also took up the symbol of the crescent moon, symbolizing feminine power, creativity, and intuition. She only wore black with white and no other colors. At the tender age of 15, Diane was forced to marry a man said to have been old, ugly, and hunchbacked. But he was a grandson of King Charles VII of France, so her parents sold her out. Upon his death, when Diane was 30, she took to wearing clothing that had only black and white as colors. At that time in France, a widow had the choice of wearing either black or white when in mourning. Diane, perhaps because she wanted to stand out, did I say she was vain? Decided to wear both at the same time. Some records say she wore the colors to represent the light and dark side of the moon, harking back to her identification with the huntress goddess Diana, but others say it was a political ploy to appear a devoted widow. She was a child molester. Diane decided that it was in her interest to become a royal mistress, so what did she do but bed the 15-year-old son of King Francis I of France, Prince Henry? Many historians believe Diane bedded the young Henry when she was 35, which wasn't hard since he was so madly in love with her and had been since he was 12. Henry was just married to Catherine de Medici, and Diane wanted to ensure that her charms really took hold with the immature prince. Just so you know, some historians believe that they were already lovers at the time of Henry's marriage to Catherine, while others say that they didn't get conjugal until Henry was older. So the exact timing and age of the molestation of the teenage Henry can be disputed. She loved being naked, and did I say she was vain? Another of Diane's favorite pastimes was posing in the buff for portraits. Here are just some of the portraits she had done of herself partially clothed or without any clothes at all. I hope you enjoyed getting the inside scoop on just how strange Diane de Poitiers was, and she remained so until her death by, guess what, a horse riding accident. I guess sometimes too much of a good thing can be, well, disastrous. Now we know the strange things about Diane de Poitiers that kept King Henry II infatuated with her right up to the end. And speaking of the end, here is the story of the tragic end of Diane de Poitiers. Diane de Poitiers was certainly worthy of the obsession that Henry II heaped on her as his mistress in the royal court of France, and she knew it. She was both beautiful and extremely vain, perhaps the most vain of all the royal mistresses in history. She even went so far as to brand herself into the image of a goddess when she designed an emblem of 3 overlapping crescents, modeling it after Diana, the ironically virginal Roman goddess of the moon and the hunt, and claimed that as her symbol of her own personal brand. She even made her likeness into a sculpture of the Roman goddess and put the statue in the middle of one of her castles, as well as having dozens of portraits painted of her as the nude and semi-nude goddess of the hunt. Pun intended. As the mistress of Henry II, Diane put herself squarely in the crosshairs of Henry's wife, Catherine de Medici, the Serpent Queen, something that would later catch up with her. Their rivalry was so intense that things got really ugly, with public digs from Diane towards her queen and private musings of Catherine as she awaited her chance for revenge. There is some debate as to when Diane de Poitiers first started sleeping with Henry. He may have been as young as 14 or a bit older than that, while Diane was an adult 20 years his senior. Either way, Henry, who became King Henry II at age 28, was obsessed with Diane and had been since he was a young child. And when he married Catherine de Medici at age 14, the obsession was already in full force. Catherine herself was only 14 and an easy target for the likes of Diane. Diane was extremely intelligent, having proven it by amassing a tidy fortune while she was married to an odious man 40 years her senior. She may have been a naive young girl once herself, but by the time her odious husband died and left her a wealthy widow, Diane had learned the ways of the world and of a vicious royal court. Henry's obsession with her made it easy for Diane to not only bed the young prince, but establish a power base as chief mistress. Upon the death of her husband, Diane wore only the colors of black and white, both colors of mourning in 16th century France, with never a variation. This was her presenting herself at court as a devoted widow and the perfect lady, while scheming for greater things. Once Diane had complete control of young Henry's heart, soul, and, dare I say, body, she was in a power position. So much so that Henry came to rely on Diane for statecraft advice, plus getting her to write letters for him and signing them under the joint name of Henry Diane. They even had a monogram made with the letters of their first names intertwined, as in an embrace. Essentially, Catherine de Medici was relegated to playing the role of the docile wife, but all the while she too was learning the strategies and tactics by which a woman could garner power in a man's world. Diane had managed to stay just on the edge of Catherine de Medici's good side throughout those early years, but Catherine was never fully accepting of Diane. She endured even while Henry gave his mistress, and not his wife, the literal crown jewels of France. Added to that, the insult of gifting Diane with the gorgeous Château de Chenonceau, a palace that Catherine coveted for herself. But then the power scales tipped in Catherine's favor. In 1559, when Diane was approaching the age of 60, Henry was injured in a jousting match where, by the way, he was wearing Diane's colors of black and white and died a few months after that from wounds encountered in the joust. As King Henry's life hung in the balance, Catherine de Medici took full control of the situation and adamantly refused to let Diane by Henry's sickbed, even as he was calling out Diane's name. Months after the jousting incident, Henry's health and mental state went into a decline and he gradually lost everything: his sight, his sanity, and then his life. On July 10, 1559, Diane's only claim to fame had passed at the age of 40, and her rival Catherine de Medici was now the powerful queen mother to Henry's young, legitimate son, the new king, Francis I. Diane's influence at court had depended completely on Henry's devotion to her, and after his passing, she experienced a very rude awakening. Queen Regent Catherine de Medici was in full-on vengeance mode, and she set her sights squarely on Diane. She not only forced the former mistress to give back those coveted crown jewels, but she also yanked back Diane's beautiful Château de Chenonceau. To exact a final revenge, Catherine barred Diane from Henry's funeral, leaving Diane clearly out in the cold. Diane de Poitiers' fall from grace was very public and very precise. After losing favor in court, she knew it was game over and she retreated into the background to Château d'Anne in northern France, watching from afar as Catherine de' Medici rose to a power that few women of her time and place in history could ever hope to achieve. Soon after King Henry II's untimely demise, Diane suffered a horrific fate in much the same manner, from the back of a horse. In 1565, when she was 64 years old, Diane was out riding when she fell off her mount, incurring enormous injuries. She never quite recovered. The infamous mistress tried her best to keep going, but died a year later when Queen Catherine de' Medici was at the height of her powers in France. Sadly, however, this wasn't Diane's last indignity. Hundreds of years after she died, during the French Revolution, the enraged citizens opened up Diane's tomb, desecrated her remains, and then threw them in a mass grave along with other aristocrats of France's bygone age. Thus was the tragic end of Diane de Poitiers, rival of Catherine de' Medici, the Serpent Queen. Next, we'll look at the relationship between Mary, Queen of Scots, and Catherine de' Medici in Mary's early years at the French court. History tells us that Mary, Queen of Scots, grew up under the care of the Queen Consort of France. Catherine de' Medici reaches adulthood and presents a threat to the Queen Consort. But was she really a threat? What exactly was the relationship between Catherine and Mary? Did they like each other? Was there spite and venom between them, as it appears in the Serpent Queen miniseries? Or was their relationship much more complex? Let's delve into this topic and find out if there was hate, love, or something in between for these two fierce and feisty women in history. First of all, it should be noted that Mary came to the French court as a child queen, the Queen of Scotland, to be exact. At only 6 days old, Mary was the only surviving legitimate child and the presumptive heir to the throne of King James V of Scotland, who died of a fever in December 1542. She was immediately crowned Queen of Scotland, in spite of a tradition that preferred only male rulers. As soon as she was crowned, the infamous King Henry VIII of England started trying to get Mary betrothed to his son Edward, and he would stop at nothing to accomplish it. But Scotland rejected Henry's proposal, and the king responded by what is now termed the rough wooing, where King Henry tried to strong-arm Scotland into agreeing to the union through brute force, which means he sent soldiers to fight against the Scots on their native soil. Scotland, terrified of King Henry VIII and losing badly to his forces, turned to France for help. The French King Francis I agreed, as long as she marry his firstborn grandson, also named Francis. From that point on, a 5-year-old Mary, Queen of Scots, was officially betrothed to Francis, the 3-year-old French heir to the throne, formerly called the Dauphin. It was then decided to send Mary to France so that she could be out of the way of Henry VIII's rampage. She was accompanied by her ladies-in-waiting, famously known as her Four Marys, and a retinue of Scottish nobles came along to watch over her, ensure her safety, and report back to the court of Scotland. She was first sent to a convent for education and lodging. There were several nuns of extremely good character at the convent where Mary was sent, and they showed a great deal of interest in her since she was a queen, beautiful, and had a loving and gentle personality. Mary developed a great attachment to these sisters and started to consider becoming a nun so she could live in the convent with them for the rest of her life, where she was with people who loved her and who she loved in return. But King Francis I of France and the Scottish nobles who had come with her from Scotland were opposed to any such plan. They intended her to be married to the young prince and to become one of the great ladies of the court, to lead a life of magnificence and splendor. So they decided to take her immediately away. Hence, she was sent to the palace of the king, where she would spend her days until her marriage to the prince. In all the years that Mary spent her childhood at the French court, she was visited only once by her mother, and I think this plays into the dynamics of the relationship between Mary and Catherine. In the French royal court, Mary was subjected to a great deal of restraint. In royal houses of the day, rules of etiquette were exceedingly specific and tightly enforced, and as Mary grew older, she was subjected to greater and greater restraint. As a result, it came to be that Mary would spend a considerable portion of every day in the apartments of Queen Catherine, mother of the little Francis to whom she was to be married. From the get-go, Catherine inwardly did not like the young Queen of Scots, but outwardly she appeared congenial enough. Some historians say that she was jealous of Mary because Mary was more beautiful and accomplished and more generally beloved than even Catherine's own daughters. It is reported that she treated Mary in rather a stern and haughty manner, and that she might even end up opposing Mary's marriage to her son Francis. Mary, on the other hand, felt entirely the opposite. Mary liked Queen Catherine and looked up to her with admiration and became attached to her, very probably since she represented a mother figure. Catherine was, after all, the mother of Mary's young fiancé, and children quite naturally develop with a strong need for attachment. Also, we need to take into account that King Francis I expected Catherine to take the child under her wing, since Mary was a queen in her own right and would be the wife of his firstborn grandson. In the Queen's chambers, the two of them would sit together and just talk, or they would work on their embroidery, which was a famous pastime for ladies of exalted rank in those days. When Mary first became acquainted with Catherine on these occasions, she used to love her company. It was said that she admired Catherine's talents and her conversational powers, and she liked very much to be in her room. She listened to all that Catherine said, watched her movements, and endeavored in all things to follow her example. Catherine, however, was cynical and thought that it might all be a pretense, and that Mary did not really like her but only wished to make her believe that she did in order to get favor or to accomplish some other selfish end. One day, Mary was asked why she seemed to prefer the Queen's company to that of her youthful and more suitable companions in the court. Mary said that she couldn't learn from the other children the way that she could learn from Queen Catherine's conversations, something which would be of use to her as a guide in her future life. One would have thought that this answer would have pleased the Queen, but it did not, because she didn't believe that it was sincere. At this point, we have to remember that Catherine de' Medici had a rough childhood and was never able to develop a feeling of trust in the world, so naturally she didn't trust this presumptuous child who could one day easily challenge Catherine's position at the court. Adding to this, the day came when Mary made a misstep in their relationship where she offended Catherine to the core. Mary was of royal blood and Catherine was not. Mary happened to say a bit boastfully in conversation in the presence of Queen Catherine that she herself was the descendant of 100 kings. This rankled Catherine, thinking that she must be considered inferior by this child who had been spending so much time by her side. I am guessing that this is when Catherine set her mind not to ever like or trust Mary, no matter how much others in the court may love her. During the course of her childhood, Mary had developed strong bonds with not only her betrothed Francis, but his sisters as well, which only increased the envy Catherine had of Mary. Fast forward to Mary's marriage to Francis on April 24, 1558, which lasted less than 2 years. By this time, Catherine's father-in-law, King Francis I, had died, and Catherine's husband was now King Henry II of France, making her Queen Consort of France. But then Henry II died on July 10, 1559 from a jousting accident, and Mary, because she was married to the first son of Henry and Catherine, i.e. Francis, suddenly became the Queen Consort. Francis was crowned King Francis II at the age of 14, and Mary was 15 going on 16. All of this put Mary in direct competition with Catherine, since Catherine was no longer Queen Consort due to Henry's death, and she was demoted to the position of Queen Dowager, which was yet another reason for Catherine to dislike Mary. But then Francis II died. Francis died 18 months after his coronation of a middle ear infection that led to an abscess in his brain. Even though Mary and Catherine spent an anxious and distraught time together by Francis's bedside as he lay dying, they still remained enemies, at least in Catherine's mind. Mary was overwhelmed with grief at the death of her husband. She knew at once what a great change it would make in her condition. She would immediately lose her rank and station. Queen Catherine would come into power as Queen Regent when her second son, Charles IX, took the throne. And now, how Mary, Queen of Scots, met her grisly end. Her adult life was forged in struggle as she grappled with the demands of the Scottish throne and the deaths of several husbands. Her life was marred by poor decision-making and political strife in a royal existence dominated by a war of wits against her own cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, and a painful series of betrayals as her own family plotted against her. In contrast, her childhood seemed idyllic. She was raised in the wealth and opulence of the French court of Henry II and Queen Consort, Catherine de Medici, also known as the Serpent Queen in the 2022 Starz miniseries of the same name. Her long struggle ended after she was forced to abdicate and her own son, James VI, betrayed her. She then met one of the most gruesome deaths in the history of European royalty. This is the tale of an infant queen whose early life was spent in opulence at the French court of the Serpent Queen, but ultimately ended in the most grisly of ways. Mary, Queen of Scots, was just 6 days old when her father died, and in the blink of an eye, the baby Mary assumed the throne as Queen of Scotland in 1542. It was a tumultuous time as King Henry VIII of England had just invaded her homeland of Scotland. At the height of this war, Mary's father, King James V of Scotland, died, and since he was left with no other living heirs than his infant daughter, the crown was hers. But his death made Mary more than just the Queen of Scots. Turns out that many thought of Mary as the rightful heir to the English throne. As Henry VII of England's great-granddaughter, Mary was next in line to the English throne, after Henry VIII's children, and because not all of England was willing to recognize any of the children of Henry VIII as legitimate, the crown was deemed by some to belong to her. Her cousin, Henry VIII, had converted to Protestantism so that he could divorce his first wife. His conversion fractured his relationship with his family and erupted the British Isles into a series of furious conflicts between Catholics and Protestants. And the Catholic Church adamantly refused to recognize any of Henry's marriages after his divorce. So they believed that his children were the illegitimate bastards of a bigamist pointing to Mary, instead, as the rightful heir to his throne. To combat this and maintain his power, Henry VIII demanded a marriage between the infant Mary and his son, Edward VI. The marriage would have forced Mary to convert to the Protestant faith and would have put an end to her claim to the throne. But the Scots refused. Mary, instead, was married off to the Catholic Prince Francis of France in a bid for the country's support. Added to this, her claim to the British throne would be signed over to France, where she would then be the queen of two countries united under one Catholic kingdom. This meant that, to the English court and the Protestant population, she was the greatest threat imaginable. Which brings us to the Battle of the Queens. For the first 18 years of her life, Mary barely set foot in Scotland. She had been rushed off to France when she was just 5 years old, where she spent 13 years as a very pious Catholic Queen of Scotland, and eventually as the Queen of France after the death of the French King Henry II. The biographer Antonia Fraser writes about Mary's time at the French court, and whether Mary was an ally or rival of the Serpent Queen, Catherine de Medici, that she was essentially judged primarily from the point of view of Francis. While Francis lived while Mary was his wife and as such a necessary adjunct to his life and happiness, Catherine would treat her with all the warmth and consideration which was her due. But once Francis was dead, once Mary was no longer the helpmeet of one child, but a potential threat to the happiness of another, the picture was liable to be very different. In other words, when Mary's husband, King Francis II of France, died of an ear infection, leaving her a widow at age 18, the throne of France was passed on to her brother-in-law, Charles IX, and Mary was immediately seen as a threat to the power of the Queen Mother, Catherine de Medici. So she was sent back to Scotland, thus changing her fate to rule over Scotland, the country of her birth, and putting her squarely in the crosshairs of crowned Queen Elizabeth I of England. But more on that in just a bit. On Mary's return to Scotland, Catherine supported her claim to not only the throne of Scotland, but of England as well. seeing the political advantage of maintaining French influence over England. Scotland wasn't the place Mary had known as a child any longer. A growing faction of Scottish Protestants had sided with the English, so much so that Scotland was quickly becoming an officially Protestant country under the religious reforms led by John Knox, a Scottish minister, theologian, and writer. And even though England was now under the rule of Mary's cousin Queen Elizabeth I, the Kingdom of France, under the rule of Queen Mother Catherine, had declared that they recognized only the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots as the rightful ruler over England. Mary's position had changed from that of a rival of the French Serpent Queen to the more dangerous position of competitor for the throne of England. Once Mary set foot on the shores of the country of her birth, a place she hadn't seen since she was a child, she was in mortal danger. Mary refused to sign a treaty recognizing Elizabeth as the ruler of England, and Elizabeth refused Mary's request to recognize her as her heir. Mary, Queen of Scots, tried to keep the peace and maneuvered to win the love of Scotland's citizens by promoting religious tolerance toward the Protestants. She even married an Englishman, her first cousin Lord Darnley, in 1565, thinking this was a way for her to strengthen her claim to the English throne. But instead, the marriage put in motion a series of events that would end in her grisly demise. Turns out that Lord Darnley was brutally abusive and jealous, and he became convinced that Mary was having an affair with her secretary, David Riccio. Lord Darnley consequently had Riccio murdered. He was stabbed to death 56 times as Mary, who was heavily pregnant, was forced to look on in horror. But Mary was stuck with the abusive Darnley since he was the father of her firstborn son, and under Catholic rules, she was forbidden to divorce. The only way she could get away from Darnley was if he died. Enter the mysterious death of Lord Darnley when, on the morning of February 10, 1567, an explosion occurred at Darnley's house outside Edinburgh. Oddly, the partially clothed bodies of Lord Darnley and his servant were found in a nearby orchard, apparently strangled but unharmed by the explosion. As for Catherine de' Medici, she took back her alliance with Mary. While she may have been shocked at the murders of Riccio and Darnley in Scotland, she nevertheless believed the English propaganda that Mary was implicated and turned her support to Queen Elizabeth I instead. The French also wanted an alliance with Elizabeth as a means to end English support for the French Protestant Huguenots, who were causing a great deal of strife under Catherine's rule in France, as well as to stand strong against the ever-threatening Spanish Catholics. With the death of Darnley, Mary was an immediate suspect. Rumors spread that Darnley had been killed under Mary's orders by her personal advisor and the man to whom she was very closely connected, James Hepburn, the 4th Earl of Bothwell. And even though Bothwell was acquitted of any charges of Darnley's murder, any lingering doubts were merely strengthened when, almost immediately after the trial was over, he roguishly married the Queen of Scots. Mary was denounced as an adulteress and a murderer, and her Protestant lords revolted against her. This led to a confrontation between her army and the Scottish nobility at Carberry Hill near Edinburgh on June 15, 1567. Mary's army was defeated and she was subsequently imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle. Her new husband Bothwell fled to Scandinavia where he was captured and imprisoned. Mary would never see him again. Her 1-year-old son James was taken from her and given her crown. To add to the misery, Mary gave birth to stillborn twins while she was imprisoned. She made a brief attempt at escape from Loch Leven when George Douglas, her prison warden's brother, helped her to raise a small army and break out of prison, but the attempt failed miserably. Mary fled to England naively believing that the ties of blood were stronger than all else that had come between her and Queen Elizabeth I. She therefore got it into her head that her cousin would help her win back her throne. But Mary was proven to be entirely wrong. Queen Elizabeth had Mary dragged into custody and thrown into prison, where she would spend 19 years in captivity under the watchful eye of her own cousin. Which brings us to the grisly execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. In the years leading up to her impending doom, Mary begged her cousin to pardon her and show mercy. But Elizabeth's court was growing increasingly paranoid about their hold over the crown and ignored Mary's pleas. Many believed Elizabeth to be an illegitimate queen to England. as her father Henry VIII's marriage to her mother Anne Boleyn was not recognized by the church. As such, plots against Elizabeth's reign were not unusual, and the Queen, consequently, was typically anxious. With Mary under her charge, Elizabeth grew only more paranoid, and when letters between Mary's jailer and a Catholic priest regarding a plot against Elizabeth were discovered, Mary was immediately implicated in having plotted against Elizabeth herself. She was thus deemed guilty of treason in what became known as the Babington Plot. Elizabeth knew that as long as her cousin was alive, there was hope from the opposing forces that Mary would become Queen of England and that she, Elizabeth, would continue to live in fear. Added to all of that, poor Mary, Queen of Scots, had to endure the betrayal of her son, now pursuing his own ambitions as a politician. He recognized that an alliance with Queen Elizabeth I would ensure his own ascension to her throne upon her death, leading him to sign an alliance with England and to cut ties to his Scottish ancestry. This included abandoning his mother, now facing execution. Add one more nail to Mary's coffin when the French, still under the rule of the Serpent Queen Catherine de' Medici, failed to make even a token objection to Mary's imprisonment and pending execution. On February 7, 1587, Elizabeth I signed Mary's death warrant, dictating that she was to be beheaded on the gallows at Fotheringhay Castle. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, was a grisly affair. The first blow of the axe missed Mary's neck and became wedged in the back of her head. The second blow was too weak and left her neck severed, but still she remained agonizingly alive. The third blow finally finished the job. The grisly details didn't stop there either. An eyewitness was recorded to have said that her lips stirred up and down a quarter of an hour after her head was cut off. Add in the heart-wrenching story that Mary's little dog had been hidden under her skirts and afterward would not leave the dead corpse and lay between her detached head and her bloody shoulders. When it was over, the executioner held up her severed head and exclaimed to the crowd, "God save the Queen!" Coming up next, why the final episode of The Serpent Queen was a disappointment even though we can't wait till season 2. The final episode of The Serpent Queen on Starz was just plain wrong in so many ways. A lot of the events did happen in history, but the sequence was skewed as well as who exactly did what to whom and when and how. Let's get right into everything wrong with the Serpent Queen final episode, with a warning that there may be spoilers ahead. 1. The Queen Mother Catherine did not poison Francis to ease his pain or otherwise. Francis II died of an ear infection that turned into an abscess in his ear, and that is what killed him. 2. Mary, Queen of Scots, did not order the death of Protestant civilians and have them hanging from trees to incite fear among the masses and force Protestants out of France. That was more at the hand of her relations, the Guise brothers. History writes that upon the death of Francis II, Charles Guise, Cardinal of Lorraine, set about persecuting the Protestants with zeal, and that his brother Francois, Duke of Guise, executed more than 1,200 Protestants, many hanging from the castle and from every tree in the vicinity, as retaliation for the botched Amboise conspiracy. More about that coming up next. 3. Catherine did not devise the Amboise conspiracy. The Amboise conspiracy is the name of the attempt storylined in the show by the Queen Mother to separate her son Francis from the influence of his wife Mary, Queen of Scots, and the Guise brothers. Except that Catherine was not the one who devised or organized this attempt, and really a whole lot of the scenes about this event were inaccurately portrayed. For example, the Protestants hanging from trees came after the attempt to kidnap the young King Francis II, not before, and not at the hand of Mary. Plus, Catherine did not stab Montmorency at all, ever. In fact, Montmorency did not even convert to Protestantism and was a staunch Catholic who continued to fight for the Catholic hold on the French court throughout his lifetime. And I don't believe there is any record of Catherine de' Medici ever stabbing anyone. Although if I am wrong, you can certainly let me know in the comments of any such historical account. The showrunners must have put in that scene purely for dramatic effect. As for the Bourbon brothers, they may or may not have been directly involved in the failed plot. Some reports state that the conspiracy was devised and led by a man named Jean du Barry, a French landholder of La Renaudie. It is said that du Barry held a grudge against the Guises when they had his brother-in-law, executed a year before, and that is why he took the lead. Another source said that the plot was fostered by the Bourbon brother named Louis, who held the dubious right as a minor prince of the blood, meaning he was a distant relative of the king. In actuality, the event did not take place on the road in a carriage carrying Francis, Mary, and Catherine. Rather, the plan provided for a march on the castle of Amboise, where the young king and queen were holed up for their safety. The plan was to abduct King Francis II and arrest Francois Guise and his brother Charles. On March 19, 1560, Du Barry and the rest of the conspirators openly attacked the chateau of Amboise. They were repelled, Du Barry was killed, and a large number were taken prisoners where they were either killed or interrogated. Louis Bourbon was suspected of involvement, fled south, and it was only after some months that the Guises were able to put him on trial. He escaped going to trial when Francis II died, and no, he was not almost beheaded as shown in episode 8. As for Antoine Bourbon, the organizers of the Amboise conspiracy tried to recruit him as a figurehead for their efforts against the Guise government, but he wasn't interested and had nothing to do with the plot. Still, he was implicated because of his brother, but it was nothing like what went on in episode 8 where he was holed up at a farmhouse awaiting Catherine's rescue. And while it is true that Antoine was in line for regent when Francis died and his brother Charles IX became king, and while it is true that Antoine gave up the regency to Catherine, it is not true that he did so when he saw his brother's severed finger. That just didn't happen. Rather, Catherine used the capture of his brother for treason against the crown as leverage over him and struck a deal where Antoine would become lieutenant general of the kingdom and Louis would be brought back into favor for the transfer of regency to Catherine. 4. There was no forged letter to Mary, Queen of Scots from her cousin Queen Elizabeth I that caused Mary to return to Scotland under the false pretense that Elizabeth would support her in an effort to remove Catherine as Queen Regent in France. Mary left France and returned to Scotland 9 months after the death of Francis as a political move to bring her closer to England in an attempt to assert her rightful place as the heir to the English crown, which did not end well for her. 5. Diane de Poitiers did not return to court. Once Henry II died of a jousting accident, Diane was removed from the French court by Catherine, relinquishing to the Queen Mother the Château de Chenonceau in exchange for the less attractive Château de Chaumont. Diane lived out her remaining years in her chateau in Annette in northern France, where she lived in comfortable obscurity as a virtual exile and died at the age of 64, from a fall from her horse during a ride from which she never fully recovered. 6. It is unlikely that Catherine herself crowned her son Charles IX, since history records that Charles Guise, Cardinal of Lorraine, did that just as he did Henry II and Francis II as well. It was, after all, his job. 7. And for good measure, the character Rahima is total fiction. The Serpent Queen did rally her female spies around her, but they were of noble birth. Regarding the invention of the character Rahima, the show's creator, Justin Haith, said in an interview for IndieWire, "Anything is fair game if the character is right. All those people exist in history, the kings and the queens, the people who serve them, the people who brought them their horses or share their lives most intimately, are non-existent in history. So you can invent those people. If you start inventing those people who got written out of history, everybody's invited." You'll be happy to know that The Serpent Queen has been renewed for Season 2. Hey, thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe and hit the alert bell to get notification of more videos on The Serpent Queen Season 2 on Starz.